Good evening and welcome to this evening's broadcast of the Africa Magazine. President Yahya Jammeh last week swept the polls in the Gambia after an election that has been described as reasonably free and fair. Opposition politician Ousainou Darboe telephoned Jammeh to congratulate him after the Electoral Commission announced results in which the incumbent Jammeh got more than the mandatory 51% to prevent a second round. Jammeh had said he would not be stretching an olive branch to opposition politicians, though many now believe he could change his mind given the grace with which defeat has been accepted. Mr. Darboe said the Independent Electoral Commission, the IEC, which some had claimed would connive in rigging the election in President Jammeh's favor, had done an excellent job. Youth singing Osama bin Laden's praises last week went on the rampage in Kenya's coastal town, Mombasa. They blockaded streets, smashed shop display windows, and sent onlookers scampering to safety. The rowdy groups had broken away from a peaceful demonstration organized by the Council of Imams and Preachers in support of the Taliban government in Afghanistan, which is under a joint military attack by the United States and its allies. Shopkeepers locked up their premises and fled the rioters. It was the second demonstration in Kenya in support of Mr. bin Laden, whom the United States considers to be the prime suspect in the September 11th suicide attacks in New York and Washington. Addressing the demonstrators, Sheikh Ali Shii, the chairman of the Council of Imams, said the US was targeting the people of Afghanistan without any evidence linking Mr. bin Laden to last month's terrorist attacks. President Yoweri Museveni has said the September 11 terrorist attacks on the United States do not only affect America, but Africa as well. Addressing a conference of head of states and governments on the African Pact Against Terrorism in Senegal, Museveni said, "The people who think the US attacks were only a problem of America will soon find out that the problem equally affects Africa because the continent's opportunity to export to the US under the AGOA deal will be sabotaged." Museveni said Africa needed to work with the West to iron out inequalities in trade between Africa and the developed countries. He said the problems in Palestine, Sudan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Burundi, among others, should be solved to bring justice. But he added that using violence in the name of seeking justice cannot be condoned. The International Telecommunications Union, the ITU, has breathed life into the first African Telecommunications Regulators Network, the ATRN, which will have as its mandate the fostering of the regulatory preconditions for developing the African Information Society and economic integration on the continent. This move is part of ITU's strategy to strengthen regulators around the globe in a bid to bring a greater range of communications services at affordable prices to more of the world's people. An overreaching goal enshrined in ITU's constitution, it is also part of ITU's efforts to foster an ongoing dialogue among regulators to learn from each other's experiences. The association, which was 2 years in the making, was formally created in Rabat, Morocco, during the ITU's recently concluded Forum on Telecommunication Regulation in Africa and in the Arab states, at which 21 regulatory agencies participated.
The news segment is brought to you courtesy of allafrica.com. Take a look through a window into the lives of more than 800 million Africans through the eyes of more than 80 African publishers. Log on to allafrica.com. Allafrica.com. All Africa, all the time. The National Museum of African Art is one of a few museums in the United States with a clear mandate to collect contemporary African arts, and it's the only museum with a permanent gallery space devoted to showcasing contemporary art from Africa. Today, under Director Roslyn Walker, the museum has grown to become a leading center for the arts of the entire African continent, featuring a world-renowned collection of traditional art, as well as a growing collection of more recent works. The current exhibition, Encounters with the Contemporary, presents selections from the museum's growing contemporary collection, from early gifts to the most recent acquisitions from throughout the African continent and across the media, including prints, paintings, sculpture, digital photographs, and mixed media. Works by important African modernist pioneers such as Valentine Malaganta, Bruce Onagbakpea, Gerard Sekoto, and Skonda Boghosian accompany those of younger artists like Gottfried Donko, Yinka Shonibare, and Bernie Surley. The exhibition draws attention to not only the rich history and continuing vitality of modernist artistic practice on the continent, but also to the history of the museum's collection and its future commitments to contemporary arts, says Director Roslyn Walker. Encounters is a reminder of where we have been and a preview of things to come, says the museum's newly appointed Curator of Contemporary Art, Elizabeth Harney. Here now in our studio to talk about some of these artists and their works is Professor Kwaku Ofori-Ansah of Howard University. Also in the studio is Bernard Gray of Maya Gallery. He's one of the major African art collectors and distributors in the metropolitan Washington area. Welcome to Roots, the arts segment of the African magazine. We'll start with you, Professor Ansah.
Hello.
In their brochure, Dr. Ansah, the Museum of African Art tells us the artists represent but a small portion of the history of modern African art and its contemporary productions. Mm-hmm. Could you please give us a sense of the scope and breadth of modern African art and comment on the significance of the particular works represented in this exhibit?
Thank you, Kwame. Is really a very important step that the museum has taken in promoting contemporary African art, because contemporary African art actually is a vehicle for the understanding of the more traditional ones that a lot of people are more conversant with. You know that art has been in Africa since time immemorial, and since our ancestors lived in the caves, they were painting on the walls of the caves. And throughout the ancient civilizations, such as the Nile Valley civilizations and Kemet and Nubia and Aksum and ancient empires and Ghana and Songhai and Mali, Meroe and so on, art has been created. So it's a continuation of the creativity of and ingenuity of the Africans. So contemporary artists throughout the ages have, especially during the turn of the century, started creating art that was a little bit different from the traditional counterparts.
You say the turn of the century, the 20th century.
The 20th century.
Right, okay.
And so they started expressing themselves in a different way from their traditional counterparts.
Right.
There were artists in Nigeria who started painting normal, landscapes as well as portraits of individuals and so on. And that developed over the years into formation of what we call art schools. For example, the Shobo School of Art in Nigeria. And then when, after independence in many of these countries, schools of art were established, where the artists went through formal training, just as in the Western world, we go through formal art schools. So some of these artists came out as artists of international caliber, and they have been producing art. But what is very important is that the art that they produce have a message that is very unique to the African experience.
Right. And talking about the artists themselves in particular, and we'll get to the message, I want to draw our attention to one of the artists featured in the exhibit, the sculpture of El Anatsui. I understand that along with Bruce Onogbokpea, he represented Nigeria at the Venice Biennale in 1990, the first that any African country participated in. Could you speak to some of the works of these artists in the exhibit?
Yes, El Anatsui and Bruce Onogbokpea are one of our outstanding veteran artists in Africa. One is a sculptor, the other is a printmaker and also a painter. And so they have actually laid a very strong foundation for the promotion of art on the international scene. So it was not a coincidence that they were invited to participate in the Venice Biennial. El Anatwi is a sculptor who uses his works to run social commentary on the African condition. One of his works talks about the coming together of the ancestors. What he does is he uses wood, basically, and he picks up wood from the surroundings and brings life into this piece of wood. So what he did with this piece of wood put together to represent the ancestors, it simply means that the ancestors are still alive and they are still with us. So he is breathing life into these dead wood, almost like reviving the ancestral spirits. Now, Bruce Onabra-Kwenya is also a printmaker who developed his own technique, which is very unique. Nobody has actually done that before. But what is interesting about him is subject matter. He uses his art to tell the history and philosophy and religious belief system of his Yoruba people, and Nigerians generally. So his works is a reflection of the total cultural values of his Nigerian society. And both are very outstanding artists who Africa is very proud of.
So in a sense, there's a blend of the traditional and the modern in the art of some of these artists. Because I understand, for instance, his name is El Anatsui, for instance. He uses the chainsaw,
that's right,
a modern equipment in his production of his art.
Yes. There is a blend of the traditional and the contemporary, as it is in all the African lifestyle today. The traditional exists side by side with the modern. So what these artists are doing is to utilize the traditional experience, traditional tools, traditional media in a contemporary fashion. And the subject matter sometimes relate to the traditional experiences as well.
Great. And if we could turn to Bernard for just a moment. Bernard Gray, of course, has been in the business for 25 years of collecting and distributing African art. He began Maya Gallery, and he's a collector in his own right. Welcome once again to the African Magazine.
Thank you.
So you got in, Bernard, my first question for you today is, do you think this show, this exhibit, Encounters with the Contemporary, will lead to a greater appreciation and demand for African art?
I think so, in a way similar to how other manifestations of popular culture, in fact, introduce people to African art. To draw the analogy, we were speaking about Janet Jackson using an Adinkra symbol, the Sankofa symbol, on her record album. People have begun to identify that symbol as Janet Jackson's symbol. However, they will also get reintroduced to that when they see it in other manifestations as well. So an exhibit like this one will begin to explore in people's minds the function of traditional African art. And traditional African art always has function to it. So as Dr. Ansah just related to the two artists, one of them, the printmaker, for instance, whose work explains Nigerian folklore and belief systems, that's its function. While the techniques of printmaking, et cetera, are clearly within the realm of how an artist creates a particular item or object. The function of it is explained to the world. This is Nigeria, this is Yoruba, et cetera. And works that have always been from Africa have always had that reality to them. They've always had some function.
And we have some of your artwork here today. Could you talk to us a little bit about what you have here today?
Certainly. Real function, like this stool from the Ivory Coast, Sanufu stool, it was a object in which people sat on, but it also has artistic value as well in terms of its design, etc. The objects that are sitting on the stool are Adinkra symbols on something called gold weights. Now, the gold weights had a function of being counterbalanced to in weighing gold in Ghana, and you would find some of them even where they added lead to make sure that the weight was a certain weight in relationship to the trading of gold. So these have the function of a very commercial function, but then the designs on them also tell a story as well, because Adinkra is a language.
It has a dual function.
Of course.
What else do we have here?
The fabric that's draped in front
yes.
is from...
I hope I'm not dishonoring
No,
you.
no,
Okay.
no, you aren't.
Okay, thanks. I should know
the
that.
long piece that's draped down is actually a skirt, a dancing skirt from the Bakuba in Zaire, and the pieces, the small panels on top are also made by the same group. As I indicated, that's a dancing skirt. We would drape it in our homes and et cetera in a decorative fashion, but the real reason it was created was for people to dance at certain festivals.
Because I know you are a connoisseur for mudcloth. You're known for
Yes,
that throughout
right.
the region.
Right.
And how do you describe this as?
That's Cuba fabric, and the skirt is called a tasca as well. The other pieces are called velvets. They have a kind of a velvet feel to them, and they were actually made to be presented to people of a certain level in their society. So it was made by people to honor the kings and the chiefs of that particular group. And so they began to have a value almost as currency as a result of that.
But speaking about this Cuba cloth, which is relatively new, do you think this may be a passing fashion or fad? You know, I speak in terms of like, you know, the dashiki trend of the 60s that came and went away. And today now we looking at, I was just looking at, for instance, if this would be a cloth that has more permanent value, you know, a fashion and design that's going to hold its own.
I think so. It's relatively new in the sense that it's new to this environment, relatively new to this environment vis-a-vis mudcloth that came before it, vis-a-vis kente that we kind of forget about almost, that came before that. It all has to do with how objects are introduced in this marketplace. And kente was the first African woven fabric that was introduced in this marketplace in any significant way. Cuba cloth has been around as long as kente has been around. It's just done by a different group of people. Right. It's woven fabric as well.
Very briefly, could you just take us through the process that's involved in collecting, distributing, and marketing African art here in the United States?
Well, in my particular case, I started collecting because I had a shop that was actually founded to present African American artists, and some African traders found their way to me, and I began to look at their objects, and I purchased objects that didn't cost as much initially because my budget was low, and it turned out that you begin to develop a taste for a particular type of objects, just like any other collector. That's how I happened to go into it. The business of collecting African art is a significant one in this country, and it's grown in leaps and bounds more significantly in the last 20 years because Africans born here are presenting it to Africans born here.
That's right.
Thank you. Is there a last word from you, Dr. Ansah?
Well, I would like to still make the connection between the traditional and the contemporary. That is the traditional that is actually continuing to inspire the contemporary artists. And as you can see, some of these Kuba fabrics actually are art forms in themselves, and they do actually inspire these artists to use some of the motifs, Adinkra symbols, art forms, in spite of the fact that they use them for special ceremonies. All gold weights are art forms. So these contemporary artists are going back to the roots, taking some of the elements of the traditional art forms and utilizing them in creating new forms for the same purpose as the traditional ones were used.
Thank you very much, Professor Ansah and Bernard Gray, for coming on board the African Magazine television show.
Thank you.
Thank you.